For any game developers trying to decide whether or not to have a detailed character creation in your game, please know that my enjoyment in creating this nightmarish creature brought my review of Blade and Soul up to a score of 7 out of 10. He's kinda badass if you can get past the unsettling stare and length of his arms. Kind of like a mix between Slenderman and Aquaman. God, I love character creation. Welcome ladies and gentlemen to A Casual Review, a series where I play and review games so you can decide if you want to try them out. In this video, we're going to be reviewing the new player experience for Blade and Soul, an MMORPG based entirely on martial arts. This is a Korean Action Combat MMO, meaning a lot of the gameplay is centered around quick, fluid combat that has the same combo systems as some popular fighter games. As far as MMORPGs go, this is more akin to Black Desert Online, with big, flashy combat animations and combos that make you smile if you can actually pull them off. The leveling in this game has a heavy focus on a main story that leads you through to max level. This means the game overall has a very linear progression path, but there are some objectives around the map that help provide a few extra things to do while you are completing main objectives. I'll go more in depth on this as we go through the review. Blade and Soul is owned and operated by NC Soft, the same company that created Guild Wars 1 and 2, as well as the Lineage series and Aeon, so the company behind the game has quite a bit of success on their resume. You can kind of see some similarities in how the game is managed, but mostly I will say that Blade and Soul feels a lot like most other Korean MMOs, with the flashy animations, hypersexualized male and female character models, and a hint of pay-to-win mechanics that you just know will affect whatever endgame content you try. First and foremost, I'll just say it now, this game is gorgeous. The developers have recently updated the entire game to the Unreal 4 engine, and the quality definitely shows. As we talk about everything else in the new player experience, I'll do my best to showcase some of the beautiful scenery the game has to offer. It definitely makes some of the other inconvenient parts of the game much more palatable. However, the upgrading graphics is bittersweet, since I can rarely run the game on full quality without experiencing heavy frame rate drops, but even on medium graphics, the sights and sounds are still high quality. As with most things in Blade and Soul, the quality of the graphics are hit and miss. As you watch some of the gameplay and cutscenes we'll walk through, you'll notice how as soon as you are wowed by something the game does really well, you'll also notice something that is completely broken, sometimes with the design and other times with bugs and other development issues. As always, a few disclaimers before we begin. I did not take part in the endgame content to write this new player review. I have completed Act 1 and 2 of the main story, which brought me to level 40 out of a possible 60. I have taken part in anything that seemed accessible to new players as they progress through the game. I also want to preface this review with telling you that I actually enjoyed the game. It has its issues, and I'm going to be nitpicking and criticizing for the rest of the video, but overall, I had a good time trying it out, more so as I got to higher levels. I probably won't be sticking with it to grind at max level, but I do intend to at least finish the story, so keep that in mind while I'm ripping it apart at the seams. But with that, let's start with an overview of the game's design. Blade and Soul does its best to focus on two main facets of its gameplay. First is the action combat. The combat is very fluid, with combos that you can pull off to make big damage numbers and cool battle animations. There are a number of combat classes to choose from, and they each have a fairly different playstyle. I decided to go for Kung Fu Master to lean in on the whole martial arts concept the game has going for it, and I thoroughly enjoyed the Fists and Feet of Fury combat styles. Unfortunately, up until level 40, you don't get much of a challenge in fights. There were a couple of world bosses that I had to pay attention to and perform some combos, but other than that, everything pretty much dies within a couple of hits. Combat only got better around level 36 when the game threw fights at me that lasted a bit longer and allowed me to use those combos and feel like a true Kung Fu master. The second focus of the game is the main story, which we will get into shortly. But first I want to make the point that the gameplay seems to have been developed fairly well. However, as you play, you start to find that every aspect of the game looks good on the surface, but has plenty of issues once you dive a bit deeper into it. For example, the combat is well designed and is fun to figure out combos to get the highest damage, but combat as a whole is terribly underutilized and lacks difficulty, a positive made worse by a separate negative. In most parts of the leveling experience, I found positives and negatives with every part of the gameplay, meaning whether I was taking part in PvE, PvP, or just figuring out how systems in the game work, I was always able to find some pretty big design flaws hidden within the individual mechanics. This makes the game pretty hostile towards new players. So first let's talk about the PvE leveling experience, which is the main form of progression in Blade and Soul. Blade and Soul's leveling experience is very much oriented around the main story quests, and scatters a couple of side quests and PvP throughout your playthrough. I feel that the idea was to create something similar to how Final Fantasy Online does their leveling progression, where the spectacle and the content of the game's story drives your motivation to continue your progression to max level. This is probably the biggest strength and the most apparent weakness of Blade & Soul's new player experience. With the Unreal 4 engine providing a great artistic and graphically impressive cutscene experience, the main story does provide a driving force to keep playing. It's all very well animated and every cutscene is voice acted, so it gives you the feeling of playing a true RPG where your character is a part of everything that's happening. Your character is involved with most cutscenes, so the style of storytelling is very immersive and effective at grabbing your attention. But there are times where the graphically impressive cutscenes and style fall short. In every cutscene, there are moments where you are immersed and captivated by the environment and characters on the screen. There are also plenty of moments where you see assets jumping around, or rendering that is incomplete. In addition, the quality of the voice acting ranges a bit. Most characters that you interact with in the main story are voiced, and even some of the random NPCs that are around the towns and camps have voice lines as well. It is very apparent which characters had experienced actors voicing them, and which had an actor that didn't perform very well. For example, the opening sequence, basically the tutorial, kicks off the main quest by showing a bit of your backstory and the dojo that you came from, the Hung Moon. At the end of your tutorial, there is an invasion by the main villain, Jin So-yoon, whose minions kill everyone in sight. The master of the dojo, your mentor, is killed and you are left to die. But during this sequence of events, I noticed that one of the disciples had a very recognizable voice. Lu Sung, the disciple that betrays the Hung Moon clan and allows the villain to invade and kill everyone, is voiced by Matthew Mercer. He does an amazing job, as is expected of one of the best voice actors in the business.
To get the Hong Moon's secret techniques, though with the school's performance today, I wonder why I ever bothered.
And his character is not alone. Like I said, most of the main characters are voiced fairly well. It just so happens that not every character is. Mostly, it is secondary characters that have poor voice acting that really take you out of the game. This happens a lot while you are questing, not in cutscenes, so I just skip through most of the quest dialogue. It's like watching a great anime with poor English dubbing. Some characters might be voiced well, and some definitely won't be. I don't mean to be rude about this, I know voice acting is difficult, and I would never say that I could do better. It just seems like even the less experienced voice actors could have done far better if they just heard themselves in the game and then tried the line one more time. Just listen to a couple of characters that you run into during the first couple of quests.
Sure, I'm still feeling lightheaded from the attack. I'd do the favor myself, but I could pass out. Since you're filling in for Doden, do his job and talk to Soji. If he gives you any trouble, call me over and I'll rough him up.
One must be involved. She's usually more careful. If we act fast, we can get our gunpowder back. Still, we don't have guards to spare. This may be our only chance to get those adders. I'm not a very good fighter, though. I'm no Yi Gan.
Leave no survivors!
As for the story itself, it starts off pretty slow. The tutorial is honestly pretty good, and introduces us to the main villains and gives you a general goal of revenge. But once you hit the main starting area, you kind of get lost. The premise of the story is very simple. The evil ninjas come to your dojo to steal your master's secret techniques and a powerful sword. Your master fights back, but since he is weakened due to some long-time poisoning by Lu Sung, the evil ninjas kill everyone in sight. Except you, who they dump off the side of the floating island because we need a plot. We get saved by a man in a very small boat who takes us to his village on the mainland, and we start the adventure from there. I finished all the way to the end of Act 2, and it wasn't until the very last quest of Act 2 that I felt invested and captivated by the story. All of Act 1, your character seems to be figuring out their training and solving some problems between villages and bandits. There are some nods to your revenge plot and some cool zombies, but nothing really interesting happens. At the end of Act 2, 40 levels later, you are in the thick of world-changing events, trying to save a girl from being consumed by an evil aura while she is unwillingly unlocking the power of a god. 40 levels took me about 15 hours of gameplay, and I was moving pretty fast. The issue here is that it took 39 levels for the story to actually resonate with me. Of course, this is just opinion, but most new players aren't going to last to level 40 just riding on the high of the awesome combat. Having a slow storyline is going to deter any new players from wanting to stick with the game. But I want to walk you through this level 40 quest, because I think it showcases a lot of the issues I just talked about. It's incredibly intense, with amazing animation, and the sights and sounds make for a captivating cutscene experience, but diving past the surface, you start to find problems. This is all from the last quest, the climax of Act 2's plot. This is possibly one of the best scenes that I had watched the entire time I was playing. But as we go through it, keep in mind what I've mentioned so far about the graphics and style, and how with each positive you get excited about, there is a negative quick to follow. The quest has you go to an altar to deliver a key which the possessed lady here is going to use to open the way to Mushin's legacy. some godly power that the evil ninjas are trying to get a hold of. Our goal is to get to the godly power first. We are ambushed by some of the militia that is working with the evil ninjas and are protected by some of the badass women protagonists. Obviously, this scene is showcasing some of the hypersexuality of the protagonists. I know that because the scantily clad female warriors had better physics for their breasts than their clothes or hair, that it won't be everyone's cup of tea. I will say that the entire game is hypersexualized in this way, so if you don't appreciate it in this cutscene, you may find it hard to watch any of the cutscenes in the game. I don't mean to make a big deal about it, but it's just something to be aware of. We allow the possessed lady to wake up the powerful bird thingy, which I don't know much about, so I can't really explain it, and we catch a ride on his back. Hitching a ride with us is Lu Sung, one of the evil ninjas that betrayed us in the tutorial. After landing at our destination, we get stabbed with the little knife, and apparently our body can't handle it. We are down for the count, but not before we get some great Matthew Mercer voice acting. But even in this scene where his voice acting is incredible, you can see the character model fidgeting around for no reason, possibly missing a voice line or some awkward expression that didn't translate into the game very well.
But I have other plans. Since her blood will help me obtain Mushin's legacy, why not use her to get it? Betraying Master Hong didn't get me the Hong Moon's secret techniques. Now, won't you say goodbye to the girl?
But the voice acting is still on point. We get saved by some goddess that hasn't really been explained yet, and we find that 3 wise old sages have come to help us enter the tomb. You wouldn't know this from me just showing you this scene, but apparently these 3 old men are supposed to be big deals and essential to the story, but the game doesn't really build them as characters all too much, so I don't think the weight of their actions are hitting as hard as the writers thought it would.
Sages do you take us for? We designed this tomb, so we know all its secrets. Still, I admit we need your help. Automaton soldiers guard the tomb.
We enter the tomb where Mushin's legacy is supposed to be, fight through some golem protectors, and face Lu Sung.
Mushin's legacy. You. I'm sorry, Idiot. You've outlived your usefulness. Not so fast!
Once again, the story is a bit broken here. You saw how I was able to defeat Lu Sung in about 5 seconds. You wouldn't know from just this scene, but he has more than once over the course of the game completely one-shotted me, so I don't understand why I was able to obliterate him so easily once I finally got the chance to fight him. Shouldn't he have put up more of a fight? I mean, just 5 minutes ago this little girl stabbed me and I was dead on the floor begging the Holy Mother to save me. Lu Sung is built up as such a badass character, and I just put him on the floor with a single punch. This is how a lot of the major story points play out in the game. Blade and Soul tries really hard to make this awesome story with these great villains, and if this was an anime, it would hit the mark. But because this is a video game, specifically an MMO, the gameplay doesn't really do the story justice. This fight is a great example of this, but it's happened many times throughout my leveling experience. The lack of urgency or scale of importance in the gameplay causes you to blow through the entire storyline without giving it much attention. The fact that the sages have chosen to stay behind and let themselves be buried with the collapsing shrine fails to make the player feel anything. I've spent little to no time with these sages, and honestly they were all pretty rude to me for the small bit of time I did talk to them. So when Yunhua, the no longer possessed lady, says okay fine and runs to safety, I figured I would have done the same thing. The entire sequence of cutscenes we just watched were exciting and well delivered graphically, but to my earlier point, its perfection is only on the surface. There are many issues that you can find if you take the time to look. I know this is supposed to be a new player review, and I just talked at length about a specific quest, so let me summarize this section for you. Blade and Soul focuses on combat and storyline progression, and although there are many parts of the game that are very well done, they are constantly battling against a number of issues, big and small, that take away from that quality. Combat is very well done, but is underutilized, and therefore, it doesn't matter if it's high quality or not. The game has a problem with difficulty and instilling a sense of urgency in the player, which detracts from the quality of the story. This means that you were forced to play through a number of hours of gameplay without anything really shining and capturing your attention. Overall, the game design lacks polish. But now, let's start diving into a couple of the main gameplay mechanics to understand the leveling experience in more detail. Movement and overall travel around the map was a large part of the gameplay, so I think it's important to mention it in the review. You are walking pretty much everywhere. You can also sprint, but only for 12, and then much later on, 15 seconds at a time. You can also jump and glide, and you can sprint in the air while gliding. It looks really cool, and it's an awesome way to traverse the overworld, especially because the overworld maps are pretty big. You truly feel like you are sprinting extremely fast, and the game actually uses the jump and glide as a mechanic to get to certain questing points. This is a very well done mechanic on the surface. Now the downside. The awesomeness of sprinting makes the time you are walking almost unbearable. When you are resting and gathering up the stamina to sprint again, you are so slow. And because you just got out of this awesome sprint, it feels so much slower. The maps are pretty big, which means in order to travel to new locations, you are going to be sprint walking a lot. And distances between locations are going to feel so much longer. This is made a bit better by the wind striding ability, which is basically a fast travel ability which you can use to teleport to any location you have already visited. This is going to be used a lot. But the wind striding ability is only available every 2 minutes, which means that if you are traveling between questing hubs to talk to multiple people, you'll have to wait 2 minutes to travel to the next hub. Your other option is to sprint walk all the way there. Last but not least is the fact that overworld maps are separated by loading portals. This is done so the game can load a specific location at a time and take less power to render. It creates instance locations both in the overworld and for dungeons, or important questing hubs. Honestly, it's not the worst thing in the world, but you go through them quite a bit, and it takes a couple seconds for you to come out the other side, so it's just another couple seconds that the game takes away from your enjoyment. If anything, it just makes the locations feel more like a game and less like a living, breathing world, but that's just me nitpicking. Combat is awesome. Honestly, if they just put me in a ring with a bunch of enemies coming in waves, I would probably have a good time with it. Combat animations are great to look at, and I had a blast trying to figure out my combos and make sure I was using them in the correct way. Every ability you have can lead into a combo, which not only does insane amounts of damage, but also usually has a super detailed combat animation. My Kung Fu Master was able to perform punch and kick combos, leg sweeps and knockups, and grapple enemies to choke them out. I also had a parry ability, where if I successfully parried an attack, I could counter with a stronger return blow. The combat UI is very simple, with a health and energy meter, and buttons that light up as combos become available. Very intuitive once you learn it. So, what's the downside? Well, as I mentioned before, there aren't a lot of times during the leveling campaign where I truly felt that my skill was being tested. Other than some world bosses that are completely optional and are supposed to be taken on by a group of players, there was no challenge in any of the fights. Not only was the difficulty insanely easy, but most enemies just dropped after a couple of hits and barely fought back. Most of the time, enemies would just use the same trick of receding into a blocking stance once they hit 50% health. And after a while, this just got annoying, which means I was going out of my way to skip as much combat as I could. Combat also takes you out of sprinting and forces you to walk until the game registers that you are out of combat, which usually takes 2 to 3 seconds after you kill something. Each time you fight, you are forced to press buttons with the ferocity and dexterity of a Kung Fu master for 2 seconds, and then walk at the pace of your elderly grandparents for 3 seconds after that. It becomes very clear that it is only worth starting a fight if you are absolutely forced to. Which I guess is kind of the whole Kung Fu mantra, right? But it doesn't translate well to video games. Now here is something that the game does very well, depending on how much you enjoy creating the perfect character model or making terrifying creatures out of human bodies. Character creation is pretty detailed, and anything you create looks even better because the graphics are so damn good. This led me to creating my extra tall Kung Fu master with Slenderman limbs and Aquaman's face. But you can pretty much play around and create whatever you want. There are 4 races, and they all look surprisingly different considering they are basically all human. Once you choose a race and a class, you have a number of sliders at your disposal to create your character. Something to keep in mind, if you make a weird, crazy looking character, they are going to be performing in every cutscene. You will have to watch as the awesome things that happen to you, or that you make happen, are all done by the creepily tall, skinny ass dude that rarely fits onto the screen. So just be aware of that. Throughout the leveling process, I always felt like I was missing something with the gearing system. Mostly because on your equipment tab, you have a number of slots to put different things, but the only equipment that I found or was given were weapons, rings, necklaces, earrings, uniforms, and soul shields. The weapons during leveling are very self-explanatory. Each class has a specific weapon they use, and you can slot 3 gems onto them to add stats. Necklaces, rings, and earrings have stats assigned to them and are very basic as well. Uniforms so far are just cosmetic, with some of them allowing you to take part in PvP, which I will talk about shortly. The soul shield is a pretty cool mechanic that allows you to pick up 8 different pieces of a full soul shield, where each piece has its own stat modifier. As you equip more pieces of the same soul shield set, you get more bonuses. There are bonuses at 3, 5, and 8 pieces equipped. This leaves you some room to mix and match sets if you feel that the second or third bonuses are not worth having all 5 or 8 pieces equipped. It's a pretty cool concept, but it wasn't really explained all that well in leveling. I was pretty much just given the full sets for playing the main story, so I didn't have to really go searching for any of them. To me, this feels more like an endgame mechanic where you can have large bonuses for PvE or PvP. You are pretty much completely geared through the main story quest, and because you are moving fairly fast through levels and quests, and there isn't much of a difficulty in combat, you never really feel the need to go searching for extra gear. Gearing didn't really feel that important, other than just ending the already short combat even faster. I'm certain that this changes for the endgame, but for new players, they do not have to worry about gearing at all. In concept, PvP seems like it would be extremely fun, having high-intensity, fluid combat against other players. However, I can see how the game could get a bit pay to win if you don't have the best gear and stats. This only matters at max level though. During leveling, PvP was non-existent. During your questing, you are given the choice to join either the Cerulean or the Crimson faction. This will act as your PvP faction, and you are given a uniform to wear to flaunt your allegiances. When you wear this uniform, you are able to fight any player at any time who is wearing the opposing faction's uniform. I didn't really know this at first, and you get something similar in the first act. I went about 30 minutes with it on before I went into a town and realized that some of the town guards were hostile to me. Then out of nowhere, someone about 4 levels above me came and destroyed me in one hit. When I finally joined the Crimson faction, I felt confident enough to wear the robe again and flag myself for PvP. The Crimson faction has daily quests you can do to gain experience and some faction reputation, so I took these on and tried them out. Up until this point, the world had been pretty empty, so I had a bit of confidence that I would be able to complete the quest by only fighting NPCs. But I saw one human player fighting against my NPC team, and I tried to fight back. I didn't check the level of this player before trying that out though, and I got one-shotted by a level 60 who was farming in this location. I didn't really understand it, and I haven't PvP'd since. The questing gets old pretty fast. The game is incredibly linear, with a large focus on the main story, and most of your quests will be go here and collect this or kill X amount of these enemies. Without any deviation from that formula comes a monotonous grind through a number of quests that you want done as fast as possible, and your request for quick completion has been granted. There is no difficulty in any of the quests or any of the combat required in the quests, so you're basically just on autopilot the entire time. If it wasn't for the cutscenes with a semi-engaging story, the questing would be meaningless. Around level 36, when the combat and the story started to feel a bit more meaningful, questing didn't feel as bad. But again, that means you have to last 36 levels of boring gameplay to get to the good part. In addition, there is really no reward for exploring the world. The maps are created to fit the story, so any location that is important, you will be told to go to. Other locations will either have nothing for you, or give you an optional dungeon that you can try and take on, but the dungeon group tool takes you out of the game and puts you into a lobby, and I couldn't find a way to actually select any of the dungeons, so I just gave up. Which means exploration and optional bosses or dungeons really meant nothing. This video is getting pretty long, so I'm going to rapid fire some of my thoughts on the rest of the game. Crafting was pretty confusing for me. It exists, but the game didn't really explain it much, so I randomly joined the Silver Cauldron Guild, which specializes in creating potions. I'm assuming it allows me to make potions as well. The guild trader told me that I could order some materials, so I did, but I didn't know how to use them, so now they're sitting in my bank. I would realize later I would probably need some gathering skills, but the game didn't really tell me how to do that, so I never figured it out. I would definitely like for the game to teach me a bit about crafting and professions, since they do seem to help me later in the game. I ran into some technical bugs while playing, and a couple were so bad that they forced me to restart the quest that I was on. The worst one was the class training quest. During your leveling, you will receive letters from an old student of the Hongmoon clan, your dojo, and they will teach you some basics of your class. Unfortunately, when I went to go do that quest, I was unable to complete it. I kept hitting the button it told me to, but the game would never register the objective as complete. So I tried figuring out what I was doing wrong for about 10 minutes, I left and came back, and then tried again. Eventually I gave up and went on with the main story. I still have that quest partially completed in my questing journal because I can't actually abandon the quest to start it over, so now I'm level 40 having not done my level 7 class quest, and it bothers me to have that in my journal. There were some human players out in the world, and definitely some in the questing hubs, but I never felt like this was actually an MMORPG. It felt more like an online RPG with an endgame that allows you to group up with other people for instance content. So if you are looking for a social experience, unfortunately this isn't it. The game never requires it, and it was never a convenient option to search for players to do dungeons that were much easier if you just just did the solo version, so there's actually a convenience factor to playing alone. Maybe this changes at the endgame, but at least for leveling, you are basically on your own. So I just criticized the game pretty heavily, and I know that you're probably thinking that Blade and Soul is terrible and not worth trying out. But let me focus on some positives for a second. First, the graphics and sound in this game are extraordinary. They aren't perfect, but they make you feel just a bit more immersed in the gameplay. Second, the story, while it may have some pacing issues, actually starts to pick up as you get to higher levels. The voice acting is mostly done very well, with believable characters and some well-written dialogue. The game is almost worth experiencing just to watch some of the cutscenes and play a part in the story. Third, the combat is phenomenal. It's so unfortunate that Blade and Soul doesn't make the combat more interesting at lower levels, but if you stick with it, it's probably the most satisfying part of the game. There are also plenty of classes to try out, each with their own playstyle, so one of them is bound to catch your attention. So, should you play it? I think it's one of those games that would be fairly fun to try, but not to commit to. There are far too many issues with the game for it to be one that you start now and stick with it to grind in the endgame. With this review being pretty critical of the new player experience and the online forums being extremely critical of the endgame and pay-to-win issues, it's hard to recommend the game right now. But I will say that this is a martial arts online RPG that is free to experience and has a decent story voiced by some great actors, so if that is your thing, it might be worth trying out. And if you don't stick with it, there's no pressure to pay anything. I don't believe that a game has to be perfect for someone to enjoy it. As long as you have fun, it's worth the price tag of free. Thanks for watching. Remember to leave a like if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel for more content. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video, because that's what I really care about. I hope you enjoy your Blade and Soul adventures, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.